Upasama Prakarana, the Quiescence, Chapter 2, the story of Punya and Pavana. The chinars have turned flaming red, while the apples, cherries, pears, walnuts and chestnuts have started dropping their leaves. It is fall in Kashmir. The precursor for winter has its own charm and beauty. If one looks at the gradual change of color from myriad greens to the innumerable shades in red and orange, the early morning frost on the grass, the multi-pitched cries of the birds in the process of migration, or for that matter, a physical silence which envelops the valley during the nights, one is bound to admire the wonderful changes in nature. The regularity with which the seasons change and the change itself is not as evident in other parts of our country as in Kashmir. However, if one looks at the baldness of the trees and a peculiar dryness in the air, then one is likely to get discouraged. Fall is the season of dusk, ushering in the end of the year, and an end does bring in the depression. It has been observed by many that invariably the patients in asylums, the prisoners in their cells, experience bouts of depression during dusk and twilight. Maybe it evokes a thought of impermanence and inevitability of death in their mind. And why do we experience uneasiness, if not fear at the thought of death? Maybe most of us see that the death punctuates the activity of the person who dies. We do not see the person transacting with the world anymore. That in spite of the wish to remain in the world, she or he is forced to leave his hold on his possessions. We see many persons leaving their dreams or desires unfulfilled when overtaken by death. Desires, unfortunately, are never ending. It is like a person in search of the horizon. The nearer he goes to it, the farther it recedes from him. It is said that Alexander the Great met an astrologer while in India, who told the conqueror that he may conquer this whole world, but then there was only one world to conquer. This thought had depressed the great Macedonian emperor, making him rethink about his conquests. On his deathbed, he had instructed the attendants that his empty hands should be seen by everyone during the funeral, so the world could know that even he had to die empty-handed. What we really are afraid of is not the death, but the prospect of leaving the things we have come to call our own through identification. Because we have not yet had the experience of death, or rather, we do not remember the experience. Socrates, one of the greatest of thinkers humankind has ever produced, was being given the hemlock. His disciples were crying at the prospect of losing the company of their master. It is said that Socrates asked his disciples to cry after his death and not when he was still alive. As he felt that a great thing, his death, was happening, they asked him how was it that he was not afraid of death. He said, "Why should I be afraid of death? I have lived my life, I have loved it, and it was beautiful. I have known it, and there is no need to go on repeating it forever. Now something new, death is at hand. I am enchanted at the prospect of taking on this great adventure. Now I'd like to see what death is." One of the disciples, Crito, said, "But Master, everyone is afraid of death." Socrates said, "I do not know. I do not understand why people are afraid of death. If atheists are right, that one dies totally and nothing is left, then there is nothing to be feared. Socrates will not be there. So why be afraid? I was not there before I was born, and I do not feel any fear about it. I'll be disappearing if the atheists are right, so what is there to fear? Or maybe the theists are right. They claim that even after the physical death, one continues to be there. If I am going to be there, then why should I be afraid? The fact is, I am thrilled at the prospect of finding out the truth of death myself, which is going to be a new field of knowledge. This episode from A Great Life illustrates that the reason for fear at the prospect of death is our identification. And this identification is characteristic feature of ahankara, evoking the fear of death. The sarga under discussion tries to impress upon the seeker that death happens only to the ahankara. Such a death is voluntary, the puny I melting into the infinite existence. When this happens, paradoxically, one is born into the life eternal. This has been very crisply expressed by the following shloka. Ayamevahamityasmin sankoche vilayam gate samasta bhuvana vyapi vistara upajayate. When the constrictive conception of he, I, etc. is gradually destroyed, the expansive jnana, which is all this universe, will arise. The constrictive function of I has been very beautifully put in a short treatise on Vedanta entitled Pratyabhijna Hridayam by Kshemaraja. Chiti sankochatma chetanopi sankuchita vishwamayaha. The Atman, or the individual monad, is merely a contracted, centralized form of universal consciousness, which is observed by the mental world of the individual which fills it. Second one says, Chitireva chetana padat avarudha chetya sankochani chittam. It is nothing but the ultimate reality which, descending from the stage of pure consciousness, becomes the individual mind by becoming contracted to and assimilated with the images of objects present in the field of consciousness. The identification with the world of objects always begins innocently enough, with the variety of raga or attraction and dvesha or aversion, but it gets crystallized with the sense of differentiation through I, mine, he, etc., which becomes the cause of bondage. That is why the sage urged Rama to transcend attachment and aversion or hatred towards objects in the field of consciousness. He said that such transcendence becomes easy for such persons who are endowed with qualities like freedom from any longing, even for mukti or aversion for bandha or bondage, who are devoid of delusion, confusion, deception and violence. That is why sage vaSishTha continued, one should try to understand the mechanism of attachment through which the attachment itself drops. Rama observed that it is easier to drop the body than the ahankara. He felt that with the annihilation of ahankara, the body will perish like a tree felled at its root. Sage vaSishTha then answered with all patience that it is not only possible to annihilate the conception of I, but mandatory for enlightenment. There are two paths to destroy the ahankara. Normally we think with certainty that we live for objects and the objects are meant for our utility, and in the absence of objects I cannot exist, and vice versa. In the first path, through vichara, one should differentiate oneself from the object. But the vichara is possible only for one whose mental activity has slowed down. For slowing down the activity, it is necessary to reduce the sense indulgence and also mental involvement. That is why one should start with abandoning the craving for the fruits of actions and performance of all actions as if in sport. This is called as dhyaya tyaga, or the renunciation of the object which can be imagined. Having destroyed all vasanas and developed equipoise, if one is able to abandon the burden of body, it leads one to what has been called as jnaya tyaga, or the renunciation of the known, the second path. Both these paths lead the pilgrim towards Jivan Mukti. The sage then went on to describe the qualities of Jivan Muktas, those whose minds are not afflicted in this life by exultation, fear, anger, poverty, sin or pain, which arise in them through the past actions in this or previous lives, are the Jivan Muktas. Those who are ever in a state of transcendence with their mind quiescent, even while performing actions, and whose company is sought by the wise, are the Jivan Muktas. Continuing, sage vaSishTha hinted that even as the attraction for the external objects ceases, the internal thirst or craving remains, which is called trishna. Trishna is the mental attraction and longing for anything. And when even this internal craving ceases completely, one reaches the state of mukta trishna. The Bhagavad Gita puts it in a shloka. Vishaya vinivartante niraharasya dehinah rasavarjam rasopyasya param drishtva nivartate. Though the sense objects recede from him who negates them externally, the taste for them lingers on. But for one who has experienced the self, even this disappears. A Kagga quatrain by Sri D.V. Gundappa says, "Best of feasts is the essence of the Supreme Brahman. Nothing to beg when you have tasted it. Vanishes then the distinction of the renouncer, renunciation, and the renounced, and you become the monarch of the universe, Mankutimma." The sage blessed Rama to become Mukta Trishna and immovable like an ocean without waves or foam. Then he told about the 4 stages of certitudes or convictions. The first kind is in which the I identify itself with this body and thinks that it is the be-all and end-all of existence. As this idea is too limited, it leads one to painful bondage. The second type of certitude arises when the I learns to disengage from the gross objects, including the thoughts, and considers itself separate from them. This certitude leads one to moksha and arises in the wise. The direct cognition within that even the universe are but the modes of I, and the I is indestructible, is the third type of certitude. This is the state of moksha and is full. The fourth type of certitude arises when the known and the knower are cognized as unreal, and the I is one without the second, which pervades everywhere. This fourth is the incomparable and the supreme moksha. Of these 4, The first is associated with bondage and is responsible for creating Trishna, while the other three are to be found only in the Jivan Muktas. The first kind of conviction, involving the identification of the I with the body, is perhaps common to most, if not all of us. And this is the root cause of all our misery. It does not, however, mean that one has to negate the body, for the body is also a manifestation of the same ultimate reality. It only means that by limiting our vision to only the gross and impermanent manifestation, the misery is imminent. For one seeks permanence in the temporal. The sage is suggesting the seeker to broaden one's outlook. With such broadened outlook, one sees the world outside non-seriously. Carlos Castaneda observes such an attitude in his teacher Don Juan. Once, when Don Juan explains Carlos that not all questions can be answered verbally, Carlos is very adamant to repeat his questions. He observes that Don Juan leaves the place totally avoiding any reply, and he suspects that his questions have annoyed Don Juan. An interesting conversation follows, which has been quoted in an earlier chapter. The Bhaktas adopt this non-seriousness towards the world by taking it to be Leela, or sport of the Lord. If one becomes serious by giving more importance than absolutely necessary, one is bound to become miserable. The yogis, treading the path of psychic control, try to make use of their willpower for controlling the senses and mind, while the persons adopting the path of Karma Yoga give up their attachment to the fruits of their actions. The method recommended by vaSishTha is the path of Jnana, in which one develops these certitudes or the mental postures. The progressive certitudes help the seeker in climbing the hill, which help her or him to loosen the grip of attachment over the world of objects. Sage vaSishTha urged Rama to be in the world and yet not allow the world to be in him. It is like the boat which can float only when the water is not in it. He indirectly hinted this by saying that it can be done by slowly turning the attention from the world outside to the world within. He said that one must become the master of action and not its slave. When one turns the attention within, one discovers that the senses and the mind needlessly grip the world of objects. When one has realized this, one learns the attitude of an actor on the stage. Sri Ramakrishna used to say that one should live like a maid servant in her master's house. Though she calls the master's son as my Hari, she knows very well he is not hers. Her children are in her own hut, or like a mother tortoise, which in spite of swimming in the sea, has her mind on the eggs on the shore. There is another Kagga by D.V. Gundappa. Build two separate rooms in the mind's abode. Play as a common human being in the outer room, and rest alone in peace in the silent inner room. This is the supreme yogic principle, Mankutimma. This attitude of non-involvement alone helps in mellowing the ahankara and can be developed by gradually eliminating the differentiating thoughts like I or you, birth or death, pleasure or pain, etc. The more one dwells on such thoughts, the more does one entangle with the world, not unlike the silkworm, which weaves a means for its own death through the cocoon. Though the process is meant for its metamorphosis, the cocoon is put in boiled water for drawing the silk thread out of it. To illustrate this point, the sage narrated an ancient story. On the banks of the Ganga, there lived the two sons of Rishi named Dirghatapas, which means long continual penance. Their names were Punya or virtue and Pavana or purity, and lived near Mahendra mountains. They were performing tapas along with their father, and virtuous Punya attained jnana in course of time through the performance of actions without being attached to the fruits thereof. But his brother Pavana had a fluctuating mind, as his jnana was only partial. The father, after eliminating all desires and becoming indifferent to the mundane existence, gave up his body that had formed a nest for birds of ahankaric actions. On account of absence of desire, the Rishi attained Brahmic bliss. As soon as the body of the Sattvic Muni expired, his consort breathed her last like a bee deserting a lotus flower. The elder son Punya, finding his parents dead, made preparations for their last rites. But the younger brother Pavana began to drown himself in the ocean of sorrow. He roamed in the forest in agitation and could not shake away his grief even in the presence of his calm brother. And Punya performed the funeral rites without any disturbance, as he was convinced that death is inevitable to life. After the rites, Punya talked to his brother Pavana, who was full of sorrow. He lovingly reminded Pavana that it does not behove a tapaswin to get entangled in sorrow, that both the parents had attained to a supremely quiescent state, that Pavana has had innumerable parents who have died, and he at that moment was aware of only the parents of his present life and not the myriad of lives he had lived in different countries. The impressions like good or bad, friend or foe, are created by the subjective pleasantness or the unpleasantness as experienced by the ahankara. Thus Punya helped Pavana to revive his own capacity to come out of the situation he had put himself in. The sage said that the two brothers lived in Brahmic bliss and ultimately attained Videha Mukti, or total liberation even from the body. Concluding the story, the sage said that Rama must eliminate the root cause of all differentiation by achieving the quiescence of mind. And compared to the state of quiescence, everything else is as insignificant as a blade of grass. The Kshira Sagara, the ocean of milk, is not so infinite. The full moon, so bright, nay, even Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth, residing in the fragrant lotus, bestows such a boon. And the ghost of desire spoils the luster of the pure mind like a cloud enveloping the moon. Moksha is nothing but the destruction of the impurities of the mind in the form of desires. This story tries to forewarn the seeker of one of the impediments in her or his journey. With much effort, one finally succeeds in overcoming the temptation of intellectual discussion and plunges into the quest. That is what is meant by Dirghatapas, having two sons called Punya and Pavana. Punya represents virtue or the goodness which has manifested as action. That is, the goodness is no more a concept in mind or a verbal expression, as in the case of most of us who involve in the critical discussions on the problems in this society, but has come to the level of practice. While Pavana means purity, which is purely a subjective concept. Both of them exist within. In fact, the seeker tries to take guidance from the concept to plunge into the sincere practice. If only the concept predominates, as it happens in the case of mere scholarship, then one succeeds only in nurturing and expanding the ego. The main reason for this is that a concept is always at the level of thought, which is but a grosser manifestation. And however lofty be the thought, it is impermanent and changes all the time. Precisely for this reason, it hardly has the desired effect on our life. Even when one starts the practice, one is not out of danger of a fall, for one is exposed to the danger of the holier-than-thou attitude, which is nothing but the ahankara that has entered through the back door. The seeker tries to give up such actions which enhance the sensual and other involvement, but in turn gets involved with the ahankara. In the story, we take the two brothers as two postures of the seeker who is involved in performing continual penance, dirgha tapas. Punya represents the practical side, while Pavana the theoretical side. That is why persons like Swami Vivekananda said that an ounce of practice is much better than tons of theory. Scriptural study forms an integral part of spiritual practice, which has been called as Svadhyaya. But actually, the scriptural study is necessary only for understanding the modus operandi of sadhana. When one begins the practice, one is expected to slowly give up the dependence on the books and to transform it to the study of the self, which is the real meaning of Svadhyaya. There is another aspect to this story. One of the most stubborn obsessions of the mind is the attachment to the past or the concern for the future. The seeker gets disturbed, if not shaken, when these pester him. The story implies that through practice, one has to overcome this obstinate mental problem. The shadow called I is responsible for all the problems that man creates for himself and to suffer needlessly. The panacea for this avoidable misery is to turn one's face away from this shadow and to face the sun of Atman. The fall, the death, or in other words, any pain is supposed to give us a glimpse into something beyond death, change or pain. It is like a person walking with his back to the sun who should realize that the shadow in front of him is there only because of the sun behind him. But usually it so happens that he sees only the dark shadow and exaggerates it. Khalil Gibran puts it beautifully. How unjust to themselves are those who turn their backs to the sun and see not except shadows of their physical selves upon the earth. The fall is only an indicator of the inevitable change. The dusk is only an intimation of the dawn, and death is only an invitation to something beyond change, which is deathless. If one takes pain to be only as a messenger who informs us that there is something wrong with our health, like the stomachache or fever, one starts taking steps towards freedom from pain, like approaching a doctor or changing the lifestyle. The fall in Kashmir is mandatory for the plants who prepare themselves for the snowfall, an opportunity for them to draw in their sap, a kind of introversion, the look within. Similarly, pain and death are mandatory for us to re-examine our understanding of life.